The dusty wind carried whispers through the streets of Silver Creek, New Mexico territory, tales that twisted and turned like tumbleweeds across the desert floor. They spoke of a man who lived where the civilized world ended and the wild began. A man whose very name made proper ladies clutch their shawls tighter and merchants count their coins twice. Thomas Tom Walker was what folks called a half-breed. Though none dared say it to his face, his mother had been Apache, his father a Mexican vaquero who died before Tom could walk. Now 35 winters old, Tom owned a sprawling ranch nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a day's hard ride from the nearest neighbor and 2 days from Silver Creek itself. The townsfolk had plenty to say about Tom Walker's ranch. Some claimed he ran cattle with Apache methods, reading the land like scripture. Others whispered he kept gold hidden in the caves that dotted his property, payment for services rendered to travelers who needed safe passage through hostile territory. But what set tongues wagging most was his spectacular failure at keeping a wife. 3 of them. Mrs. Henderson declared at the general store, her voice carrying the authority of the town's premier gossip. 3 mail-order brides in as many years, and not one lasted more than a week. The first had been Charlotte from Pennsylvania, a delicate creature who'd taken one look at the endless expanse of scrubland and burst into tears. She'd spent 4 days huddled in the cabin before begging Tom to take her back to town. The second, Margaret from Ohio, had seemed hardier. She'd unpacked her bags and even started a garden, but when a dust storm blew through on her 6th day, she'd packed up again, declaring she'd rather die a spinster than live another moment in Satan's own wasteland. The third bride had lasted the longest, almost 8 days. Sarah from Boston had arrived with grand plans to civilize both Tom and his ranch. She'd brought curtains, china, and a piano that took 4 men to haul up the mountain road. But when Tom had returned from checking his herd to find she'd thrown out his mother's Apache blankets and cooking pots, replacing them with her proper Eastern furnishings, something cold had settled in his dark eyes. He'd loaded her and her piano back onto the wagon himself, his jaw set like granite. After Sarah's departure, the mail-order bride agency in St. Louis had sent a terse note suggesting Tom might want to reconsider his circumstances before requesting another match. The ladies of Silver Creek had tittered over that for weeks. But Tom Walker was nothing if not persistent, or perhaps desperate, living alone on that wind-swept ranch, with only his horse and cattle for company, would drive any man to extremes. His Mexican ranch hands came and went with the seasons, and while they respected him, they kept their distance. Tom belonged fully to neither world, too Apache for the whites, too Mexican for the Apache, too much of everything for the delicate sensibilities of Eastern women seeking Western husbands. So, when Tom rode into Silver Creek that autumn morning, his spurs jangling against the wooden sidewalks, folks noticed. He hitched his paint horse outside the post office, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His leather duster was trail-worn but clean, his black hat pulled low against the morning sun. Mrs. Henderson, peering through her shop window, noted that he'd shaved recently, always a sign Tom Walker meant business. Inside the post office, Jeremiah Hollis looked up from sorting mail, his fingers stilling on the envelopes. "Morning, Tom." "Jeremiah." Tom's voice was low, accented with the musical cadence of Spanish and something else, something older. "Any mail for me?" The postmaster's eyes darted to a single envelope on the counter, clearly set aside. "Well now, that depends. You still writing to that agency in Chicago? The new one?" Tom's weathered hand reached for the letter, but Jeremiah pulled it back slightly. "Tom, we've known each other since we were boys. Maybe it's time to accept that some men are meant to live alone." "That's my business." "Jeremiah, is it when half the town makes bets on how long the next poor girl will last?" Something flickered in Tom's dark eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or anger carefully controlled. "The letter, please." Jeremiah sighed and handed it over. "From Missouri this time, Kansas City." Tom tucked the envelope inside his duster without reading it. He'd wait until he was alone, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. But Jeremiah wasn't finished. "Tom, why do you keep doing this to yourself and to them?" Tom paused at the door, his broad shoulders filling the frame. For a moment, Jeremiah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, "You ever watch a wolf circle a campfire? Jeremiah, it knows the fire might burn, but the cold and dark are certain death. Sometimes a man's got to take his chances with the burning." He left before Jeremiah could respond, his boots echoing on the planks outside. Mrs. Henderson emerged from her shop as if by coincidence, but Tom touched his hat brim and kept walking. Let them talk. They always did. The ride back to his ranch took Tom through country that would break most men's spirits. Red rock canyons yawned like hungry mouths. Sparse juniper and piñon pine clung to rocky soil. In the distance, the mountains rose blue and hazy, their peaks already dusted with early snow. This was hard country, unforgiving country. But it was his country, bought with sweat and blood, and the kind of stubborn determination that kept a man writing letters to marriage agencies even after 3 spectacular failures. As his horse picked its way up the familiar trail, Tom finally pulled out the letter. The Chicago agency had been his last hope. They specialized in what they delicately called unusual circumstances. He'd been honest in his correspondence, half Apache, half Mexican, living isolated on a ranch that tested even strong men's resolve. He'd mentioned the failures, too, though he'd softened the details. No need to explain about Charlotte's hysteria or Sarah's rigid Eastern ways. The letter was brief, written in a careful, educated hand. Mr. Walker, my name is Ruth Collins. I am 30 years of age and currently serve as a matron at St. Mary's Orphanage in Kansas City. I have read your letters to the agency with great interest. You write of isolation and silence as if they are things to be feared. I have lived 30 years surrounded by noise and souls, yet found only loneliness. I do not fear empty spaces or hard work. I do not require conversation or society. What I fear is a meaningless life, days that blend together without purpose or partnership. If you are still seeking a wife who will not flee at the first silence or the 100th, I am willing to correspond further. Yours in earnest consideration, Miss Ruth Collins. Tom read the letter twice, then once more. No mention of his mixed blood, no promises of bringing civilization to the wilderness, no romantic notions of Western adventure. Just a simple declaration she didn't fear what had sent the others running. That night, Tom sat by his fire, composing his response by lamplight. Through the window, coyotes howled in the darkness, their cries echoing off the canyon walls. He wrote slowly, choosing each word with care. He told Ruth Collins about the ranch, about the hard winters and harder summers. He wrote about the nearest neighbor being a day's ride away, about the Apache who still passed through his land on ancient trails, about the Mexican vaqueros who sometimes stayed for a season but always drifted on. He almost wrote about Maria, his first wife, not a mail-order bride, but an Apache woman who'd understood the silence and the space. But she died 10 years ago, taken by a fever no medicine could break, and some wounds were too deep for letters. Instead, he wrote about the work cattle and horses, mending fences and hauling water, the garden that needed tending and the house that stood empty of all but the most basic comforts. I will not lie to you, Miss Collins, he wrote. 3 women have come here as brides and left as strangers. Perhaps the fault is mine. Perhaps I am too much of this land to live with those who are not. But if you are willing to risk it, I offer you an honest partnership, hard work, and a purpose that matters. The land here doesn't forgive weakness, but it rewards strength with a kind of freedom most never know. He sealed the letter and set it aside to post on his next trip to town. Then he walked out into the darkness. Standing on the porch he'd built with his own hands, the stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the thin mountain air, somewhere in Kansas City. Ruth Collins was perhaps looking at the same stars, though dimmed by city lights and smoke. Tom allowed himself a moment of hope, fragile as frost on a window pane. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe Ruth Collins was telling the truth about not fearing silence and space. Maybe she wouldn't look at his Apache cheekbones and Mexican skin and see only a savage to be civilized or feared. Or maybe she'd last 5 days instead of 7, and the good people of Silver Creek would have new material for their gossip. Tom had learned to live with maybe. It was all the hope a man like him could afford. The coyotes called again, closer now, and Tom went inside to tend his fire. Winter was coming, and whether Ruth Collins answered his letter or not, the cattle would need feeding, the fences would need mending, and the land would demand its due. He'd learned that from his Apache mother and Mexican father. Both the land was the only truth that mattered, and it would be here long after the last mail-order bride had fled back to civilization. But still, as he banked the coals for the night, Tom Walker hoped. It was a hard thing to kill. Hope. Perhaps that's why he kept writing letters, kept believing that somewhere there was a woman who could look at his life and see not exile but home. Perhaps Ruth Collins, with her fear of meaningless days, would understand what he offered, not comfort or ease, but purpose carved from rock and sky. A life that mattered because it was hard-won and real. Time would tell. Time and the trial of those first 7 days that had broken every other woman who'd tried to make a life with Tom Walker on the edge of the world. The November sky hung low and gray when Tom Walker stood at the Silver Creek Depot, watching the westbound stage approach through a veil of dust. He'd received Ruth Collins's telegram 2 weeks prior, arriving November 15th. No need for fanfare. R.C. No need for fanfare. Tom had almost smiled at that. The stage rolled to a stop, horses snorting and stamping after the long haul from Santa Fe. Tom watched the usual passengers disembark: a traveling merchant, a rancher's wife returning from visiting family, 2 cowboys heading for work at the Rocking J. Then, last, a woman emerged. She didn't wait for assistance from the driver. Instead, she gripped the doorframe and stepped down herself, a worn leather satchel in one hand and a modest carpetbag in the other. Ruth Collins was neither beautiful nor plain, but there was something in the way she moved, deliberate, economical, without the fussy adjustments to hair and clothing that Tom had seen in his previous mail-order brides. She wore a practical gray traveling dress, unadorned save for neat black buttons. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot when she turned to scan the small crowd at the depot. Her eyes, brown as coffee and just as bitter bright, found Tom immediately. He approached, removing his hat. "Miss Collins." "Mr. Walker." She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. Her gaze was direct, assessing. "You're taller than I expected." "Most folks say that." He reached for her bags. "May I?" She hefted the leather satchel higher on her shoulder. "This one I'll keep. It has my personal effects. You may take the carpetbag." Tom noted the weight of the carpetbag, substantial but not excessive. Sarah from Boston had brought 7 trunks. "My wagon's just there. We've got a fair piece to travel before dark." "I expected as much." Ruth secured her satchel and followed him without hesitation. As they passed the general store, Mrs. Henderson practically pressed her nose against the window. Tom saw Ruth notice, saw her shoulders straighten slightly. But she said nothing. She climbed into the wagon without assistance, settling her skirts with practical efficiency. The first hour passed in silence. Tom had prepared speeches, explanations about the ranch and its isolation. But Ruth seemed content to watch the landscape unfold. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, though he noticed her eyes missed nothing, not the hawk circling overhead, not the abandoned homestead they passed, not the way the road deteriorated the further they traveled from town. Finally, she spoke. "How long since the last rain?" Tom glanced at her, surprised. It was a rancher's question. 6 weeks, maybe 7. The grass shows it. She pointed to the brittle yellow stems beside the road. "In Missouri." We'd call this a drought. I suppose here it's just November. You know land. I know hunger. Her voice was matter of fact. 30 orphans teach you to read every sign of scarcity. Weather, crop yields, the mood of donors. It all matters when you're counting portions. They climbed higher, the road switching back through red rock formations. Tom waited for questions about amenities, about neighbors, about when they'd return to town for supplies. Instead, Ruth asked, "What's your water source?" "Spring-fed creek runs year-round. I've got storage tanks for dry spells." She nodded, satisfied. "And your nearest neighbor?" "The Sandoval family. Days ride east. Good people. They run sheep. Livestock disputes." Tom looked at her again, longer this time. "No, I helped them dig a well 2 summers back. They helped me with branding come spring." "Mutual benefit." She seemed to approve. "That's how it should be." As they entered the canyon approach to his ranch, the wind picked up, cutting cold through the wagon. Tom saw Ruth pull her shawl tighter but heard no complaint. Charlotte would have been weeping by now. Margaret would have been demanding to know how much further. Sarah would have been cataloging everything she'd need to change. Ruth simply observed. The ranch buildings came into view as the sun touched the western peaks, the main house of adobe and timber, the barn and corral, the smaller bunkhouse for seasonal workers. Everything sturdy, functional, and utterly devoid of softness. "It's smaller than I pictured," Ruth said, not critically, just observing. "But the placement is good. Protected from the north wind. Clear sight lines to the approaches." "You've thought about such things. A woman alone thinks about many things. Mr. Walker." Tom pulled the wagon up to the house. This was usually when the tears started, or the brave faces crumbled. He climbed down and rounded to help Ruth, but she was already on the ground, retrieving her carpet bag. "If you'll show me inside, I'd like to see what we're working with." Tom noted the pronoun. "This way." The house was as he'd left it, clean but bare. A main room with fireplace, kitchen area to one side, 2 bedrooms, one his, one standing empty. Basic furniture he'd built himself. No curtains, no cushions, no gentle touches. Ruth walked through slowly, running her fingers along surfaces, checking the stove, peering into cupboards. She said nothing, but Tom saw her mentally cataloging, the same way she'd studied the land. "The spare room is yours," he said when her inspection was complete. "I'll bring your bag." In a moment, she turned to face him fully. "First, I need to know the work. The real work. Mr. Walker. Not what you think a woman wants to hear. What needs doing here?" Tom had rehearsed polite lies about light housekeeping and perhaps a vegetable garden. But something in Ruth's direct gaze demanded truth. "Everything," he admitted. "I keep it clean enough, but there's no system. I cook to eat, not to enjoy. The garden's gone to seed. There's mending piled up. Preserving that doesn't get done. The root cellar needs reorganizing. The chicken coop I built stands empty because I never got around to getting chickens. I work dawn to dark on the cattle and horses, keeping fences mended and predators at bay. The house," he gestured at the bare walls, "the house just exists." Ruth nodded slowly. "And you want it to be a home?" It wasn't a question. Tom found himself nodding. "Well then." She unpinned her traveling hat, set it on the table. "If I'm to make a home here, I'll need to know what I'm working with. Show me the kitchen stores." For the next hour, Ruth conducted an inventory that would have impressed an army quartermaster. She checked every sack of flour for weevils, every tin for rust. She asked about supply runs, about what grew wild that could be gathered, about trading with the Sandovals. When she found his mother's grinding stones tucked in a corner, she paused. "You know how to use these?" "My mother taught me, for corn. Chiles." He hesitated. "The last woman said they were savage tools." Ruth lifted the stone, testing its weight. "The last woman was a fool. These will outlast any store-bought mill." She set it carefully back. I'll need you to show me the proper way. My grinding might be different from what you're used to. By the time they'd finished the tour, full dark had fallen. Tom lit the lamps while Ruth efficiently unpacked her few belongings into the spare room. He started a simple supper: beans, salt pork, the last of the bread from town. Ruth emerged having changed into a work dress, her hair still severely pinned. She surveyed his preparations without comment, then quietly began improving them. She found wild onions in his stores he'd forgotten about, added them to the beans, located a tin of tomatoes, incorporated those too. By the time they sat to eat, the simple meal had become something more. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ruth seemed to understand that words weren't always necessary. When they finished, she cleared the dishes with the same quiet efficiency. "I'll need to know your routine," she said as she washed. "When you rise, when you need meals, what tasks are most urgent? I won't interfere with your work, but I'll need to plan mine around it. I'm up before dawn, earlier in summer. Coffee then. Breakfast when the morning work's done. Noon meal if I'm near the house. Supper at dark." "Simple enough." She dried the last plate. "And washing day?" "When things need it." The look she gave him was almost amused. "I see. Well, we'll establish a proper schedule. Mondays, I think, the Sandovals. Do they have a woman who might trade work? Washing is easier with two." "Senora Sandoval. Maria. She might—" Tom had never thought to ask. "I'll write her a letter. You can take it when you next ride that way." Ruth hung the dishcloth to dry. "Now, what needs mending most urgently?" Tom fetched the pile of damaged clothing he'd been meaning to fix: shirts torn by wire, trousers worn through at the knees. Ruth examined each item like a doctor with a patient. "I'll need better light to do this properly. Tomorrow." She folded everything neatly. "Tonight, I need to understand something else." She sat across from him at the table, hands folded. "Your previous wives, what exactly sent them running?" Tom had dreaded this question from the moment she'd stepped off the stage. "The isolation, the silence, He struggled for words. "The hardness of everything." "No." Ruth shook her head. "That's what they told you. What really drove them off? Was it fear of the Apache blood everyone whispers about, disgust at the Mexican ways? Or was it that you never asked them to be partners? Only decorations?" The accuracy of her guess stunned him. "I don't know what you mean." Mr. Walker," she leaned forward slightly. "I've read your letters. You describe this ranch like a fortress to be endured, not a life to be built. Did you ever ask those women what they thought should be done? Did you include them in the work that matters? Or did you expect them to create a soft corner in your hard world and be content?" Tom felt heat rise in his face. "I tried to protect them from the worst of it. And in doing so, you made them useless, ornaments in a place that has no room for mere prettiness." Ruth sat back. "I'm not here to be protected. Mr. Walker, I'm here to build something. If you want another decoration, put me on tomorrow's stage. If you want a partner, then treat me as one." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Tom spoke. "What do you need to know?" Ruth almost smiled. Almost. "Everything. The real problems, not the polite ones. Which fences fail most often? What predators threaten the stock? How long can we go between supply runs in bad weather? What preservation methods work in this climate? Who can be trusted in town and who can't?" She paused. "And what happened to your first wife, the real one, not the mail-order brides?" Tom's hands stilled on the table. "How did you know?" "A man doesn't learn to keep house this neat without a woman's teaching. The grinding stones, the arrangement of the kitchen. Someone loved this space once, someone who understood it." Her voice gentled slightly. "I'm not looking to replace her, Mr. Walker, but I need to know what ghosts I'm living with." So Tom told her about Maria, daughter of the Apache scouts who'd worked for the army, how they'd met when he was barely 20, both of them caught between worlds. Their quiet courtship, their quieter wedding, the 5 good years they'd built together, the fever that had taken her and their unborn child one brutal summer. After that, he finished. The house just stopped. I kept it like she left it for years. Then loneliness got too heavy, and I wrote to that first agency. Ruth nodded slowly. And they sent you women who wanted to change everything. Yes. Fools. She stood, began preparing for sleep. You don't change a house that's been loved. You learn from it, then add to it. She paused at her bedroom door. What time is that dawn coffee? An hour before sunup. I'll have it ready. She met his eyes. Partners, Mr. Walker. That means all the work gets shared. The hard parts and the necessary parts. No protection, no pretenses. Agreed. Tom found himself nodding. Agreed. Ruth disappeared into her room. Tom sat alone by the dying fire, wondering at the strange woman who'd walked into his life with her leather satchel and direct questions. She hadn't asked about his blood, hadn't flinched at the isolation, hadn't wept at the stark reality of the ranch. Instead, she'd asked about water sources and fence lines, about grinding corn properly and organizing washing day. For the first time in 10 years, Tom Walker felt something shift in his chest. Not love. That was far too soon and too complicated. But possibility. Ruth Collins looked at his hard life and saw not something to endure, but something to engage with. She'd asked to be a partner, after 3 failures and 10 years of ghosts. Tom thought perhaps he was ready to let her try. True to her word. Ruth had coffee ready when Tom emerged in the pre-dawn darkness. She moved quietly in the kitchen, her hair already pinned, her work dress neat despite the early hour. The coffee was strong, the way he liked it, though he hadn't told her his preference. Biscuits will be ready when you return, she said, handing him the steaming cup. I found your sourdough starter. It needed feeding. Tom paused. He'd forgotten about the starter, shoved to the back of the cold box months ago. Maria had begun it their first year together. You know sourdough? Every woman who's fed 30 children knows sourdough. It stretches flour. She was already kneading dough, her movements practiced. Go on. Cattle don't wait for conversation. Over the following days, a pattern emerged that felt both new and somehow inevitable. Ruth worked with a quiet efficiency that transformed tasks without fanfare. She didn't announce her improvements or seek approval. Things simply got done. The neglected mending pile disappeared. The kitchen organized itself into logical systems. Meals appeared at consistent times, simple but satisfying. What struck Tom most was her observation. She watched everything which gait he favored when his left shoulder ached, where he typically left his gloves, how he liked his eggs. By the 4th day, she was anticipating needs he hadn't voiced. A fresh shirt appeared on his bed the morning after he'd torn his sleeve on barbed wire. Hot coffee waited when he came in late from tracking a stray heifer. But she watched more than just domestic details. The 3rd evening, as they ate a stew she'd made from beef, wild onions, and foraged greens, she said, The fence line by the eastern draw. You check it more than the others. Tom looked up, surprised. Cattle like to push through there. Ground softer. Show me tomorrow. If I know the problem areas, I can check them when you're elsewhere. That's not women's work. Ruth's spoon stilled. Mr. Walker, we agreed. No protection, no pretenses. If something needs doing and I can do it, then it's my work. The next morning, she joined him at the eastern fence. She wore a pair of canvas trousers under her skirt. Practical, modest, but allowing for movement. Tom showed her how to spot where cattle had been testing the wire, how to do temporary repairs. I'll need to learn the proper repair too, she said, examining his work. But this will hold if you're far off and I spot trouble. Yes, she nodded, satisfied. That afternoon, while Tom worked the northern pasture. He saw her walking the fence line, checking each post with the same methodical attention she gave to sorting beans. The 7th day arrived gray and cold, with the smell of snow in the air. Tom found himself tense, waiting. This was when Charlotte had broken, sobbing over breakfast about the endless sky. This was when Margaret had announced she couldn't bear another night of coyote songs. Sarah had lasted 1 day more, but by day 7 she'd been packing those china plates, lips pursed in disapproval. Ruth seemed unaware of the significance. She rose at her usual time, made breakfast, discussed the need to move the cattle to lower ground before the storm hit. When Tom mentioned he'd be riding to check the far herd, she packed him food without being asked. "I'll bring the chickens in," she said. "We don't have chickens." "We do now. I traded Mrs. Sandoval yesterday. She came by while you were out. I sent word with that family passing through last week. 6 good layers for that bolt of calico Sarah left and some preserved peaches." Ruth wrapped the food in clean cloth. "The coop needs minor repairs, but they'll be fine for now." Tom stared. "You traded away Sarah's calico?" "Was there someone else planning to wear it?" Ruth's tone was dry. "Chickens produce. Cloth sitting in a trunk does not." As Tom rode out, he realized Ruth had not only survived the crucial 7th day, but seemed to have forgotten to count. She was focused on chickens and storm preparations, not on calendars or escape routes. The storm hit that afternoon, driving snow horizontal across the high country. Tom pushed hard to get the cattle moved, arriving home near dark to find the house transformed, not decorated. Ruth hadn't hung curtains or added frills, but warm, alive. Lanterns glowed in windows he rarely lit. The smell of baking bread mixed with something savory bubbling on the stove. Ruth was securing a shutter when he entered, snow on her shoulders. "The chickens are in the barn," she reported. "I've brought in extra wood and water. Your stores list showed adequate supplies for a week's confinement, but I've made sure everything's accessible." Tom stood dripping in his own doorway, watching this woman who'd taken his fortress of solitude and made it functional. Not soft, not pretty, functional. Ready. "You're soaking." She retrieved a towel, handed it over with the same matter-of-fact care she did everything. "Dry off? Supper's almost ready." As he changed into dry clothes, Tom could hear her moving about, the small sounds of occupation that had been absent for so long. The clink of plates, the scrape of a spoon, the creak of floorboards under purposeful steps. Not the nervous flutter of his previous brides, but the steady rhythm of someone who belonged. They ate as the storm built strength, wind howling around the corners of the house. Ruth had made a pot roast from tough beef, transforming it with slow cooking and patience into something that warmed from the inside. "This storm will last days," Tom said, "sometimes a week." I assumed as much. Ruth calmly buttered a biscuit. "Good time for inside work. That pile of harness that needs mending, the tools that want sharpening. I'll need you to teach me about the grinding stones too. Cornmeal would vary our diet." Other women had seen storms as imprisonment. Ruth saw opportunity. That night, as the blizzard raged, they sat by the fire. Tom worked on repairing a bridle while Ruth darned socks with tiny, precise stitches. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the pop of burning piñon and the storm's fury outside. "At the orphanage," Ruth said suddenly, "the children feared storms. 30 scared young ones in one building, crying with each thunder crack." She turned the sock, examining her work. "I learned to make storms into stories. Adventures happening outside while we were safe within. It changed their fear into excitement." "Did you fear them before?" "I feared everything before." Her needle never paused. "When you're small and alone, the whole world seems made of threats. Then you survive enough of them, and fear becomes just another task to manage." Tom thought of his own childhood, caught between 2 worlds, neither fully accepting him. "Yes." She glanced at him, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. They worked on in companionable quiet until Ruth set aside her mending. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "about Frank Morrison." Tom's hands stilled. A husband, a lover left behind. He offered marriage 3 times. Ruth stared into the fire. "A good man, owned a dry goods store. Could have given me comfort, respectability, children of my own instead of other people's." She paused. "I considered it each time, but when I imagined that life, the same 4 walls, the same small concerns, the same face across the breakfast table talking about the same nothing, I couldn't breathe." "Why tell me?" "Because you should know I chose this." She met his eyes directly. "I didn't come here running from something. I came running to something, the silence you think drives women away. I've been searching for it my whole life. A place where thoughts can stretch to the horizon, where work matters because survival depends on it, where a person can be useful instead of ornamental." The wind gusted, driving snow against the windows. Ruth returned to her darning. Tom found his voice. "The others said I trapped them here." "Did you? Or did they trap themselves with expectations?" She held up the completed sock, examining it critically. "A cage is only a cage if you're trying to get out. Otherwise, it's just a structure. Depends on what you build inside it." They worked until the fire burned low. When Ruth rose to retire, she paused at her door. "Tomorrow, if the storm permits, I'd like to learn about the root cellar. Proper organization could improve our stores significantly." "Our stores." Tom tested the words. "You mean to stay, then?" Ruth tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Walker, I've just spent a week establishing systems. Do you think I'd waste that effort? I'm New England stock. We don't abandon investments lightly." A ghost of humor touched her lips. "Besides, those chickens need tending, and you clearly can't be trusted with poultry." After she'd gone to bed, Tom sat alone, listening to the storm. 7 days. Ruth Collins had lasted 7 days without complaint, without tears, without a single mention of leaving. More than that, she'd integrated herself into the ranch's rhythm as if she'd always been there. She saw work where others saw hardship, opportunity where others saw isolation. He thought of her hands, competent and unadorned, fixing what was broken without fuss. He thought of her questions, practical and pointed, cutting straight to what mattered. He thought of her silence, comfortable as broken-in boots, demanding nothing but presence. The Mexican families had a saying, "El amor entra por la cocina." Love enters through the kitchen. Tom had always thought it meant through food, through nurturing. But watching Ruth work, he wondered if it meant something else. Maybe love entered through shared labor, through understanding what needed doing without being told, through strong coffee at dawn and mended fences and chickens appearing because someone thought ahead to trade. It was too soon to call it love, but something had entered through Ruth's quiet efficiency, her practical grace, something that made the house feel less like a shelter and more like what she'd named it from the start, a home. The storm would rage for days, trapping them together. Tom found, with surprise that bordered on wonder, that he didn't mind. Ruth Collins, with her sharp eyes and steady hands, had brought something besides chickens to his ranch. She'd brought the possibility that isolation didn't have to mean loneliness, that silence could be shared, that some women didn't want to civilize the wilderness, but to meet it on its own terms. 7 days. Tom smiled into the dying fire. Let the good people of Silver Creek start new rumors. Ruth Collins had lasted the week, and from the look of things, she was just getting started. The storm lasted 4 days. By the 2nd day, Tom expected restlessness, complaints about the confinement, anxious glances toward the door. Instead, Ruth created a systematic assault on every neglected corner of the house. She approached the work with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything, turning the storm-forced imprisonment into productivity. "Hold this steady," she instructed on the 3rd morning, positioning Tom at one end of a heavy shelf in the root cellar. They'd been reorganizing since dawn, Ruth having discovered that half their stores were poorly arranged, leading to waste. The potatoes were sprouting because they were too near the onions, she explained, directing him to move the shelf. And these preserves from, she checked a date scratched on a jar lid, 3 years ago need using or discarding. Waste is a sin when survival depends on planning. Tom found himself following her directions without question. She had a gift for organization that transformed chaos into order. By afternoon, the root cellar was a model of efficiency, everything labeled and arranged by use and season. "Your first wife," Ruth said suddenly, examining a collection of preserved chilies. "Maria, she knew her business. These are perfectly done." Tom's chest tightened. The other women had wanted him to throw out anything of Maria's. "You don't mind them?" Ruth looked at him as if he'd asked whether she minded the sun rising. "Why would I mind good work? These will last another year at least. She'd be foolish to see them wasted." She paused, then added quietly, "The living honor the dead by using what they left well, not by discarding it." That evening, she prepared a meal using some of Maria's preserved goods, combining them with her own cooking in a way that felt like conversation across time. Two women who'd never met, collaborating through shared understanding of what this land required. The wind still howled, but inside, the house felt different. Warmer, yes, but more than that. Occupied, Ruth had claimed space without destroying what came before. She'd added her presence to the existing structure like mortar between stones, strengthening rather than replacing. On the fourth morning, Tom woke to silence. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world buried in white. He found Ruth already up, coffee made, studying the changed landscape through the kitchen window. "We'll need to check the animals," she said without turning. "That drift against the barn worries me, and the chickens will need clearing." Tom noticed she said "we," not "you." Since that first fence line lesson, she'd inserted herself into ranch operations with quiet insistence. When he'd protested that certain tasks were too hard, she'd fixed him with that level stare and said, "I've lifted orphans through fever and cleaned their sick. I've fought off men who thought a woman alone meant easy prey. I've made meals from nothing and stretched pennies until they screamed. Don't tell me about hard." They worked together to dig out from the storm. Ruth wielded a shovel with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, her movements economical and effective. When they reached the chickens, all 6 had survived, huddled together in the insulated corner she'd prepared. "Good girls," she murmured, scattering feed. "Earned your keep staying alive." The cattle had weathered the storm in the lee of the cliffs where Tom had moved them. Only one calf showed signs of struggle, and Ruth helped him carry it to the barn for warming. "It'll need watching," Tom said as they settled it in clean straw. "Every few hours. I'll take the night checks. You need your sleep for the heavy work." He started to protest, then stopped. "Partners," she'd said. That meant sharing the hard parts, too. That afternoon, as they finished the last of the storm cleanup, a rider appeared on the horizon. Tom recognized Juan Sandoval, the eldest son of his neighbors. The young man pulled up, clearly surprised to see Ruth working alongside Tom. "Senor Walker." Juan touched his hat brim. "My mother sends greetings and asks if all is well after the storm." "All's well, Juan. Thank your mother." Tom noticed Juan's curious glances at Ruth. "This is Miss Collins, my wife." The word came out without thought, but Ruth showed no surprise. She nodded to Juan with calm dignity. "Please tell your mother I look forward to meeting her properly. Perhaps she would visit when the road's clear." Juan's eyes widened slightly. The previous mail-order brides had never extended such invitations. "Si, señora. She will be pleased." He turned his horse but paused. "Senor Walker, my mother says to tell you the spring gathering will be early this year, last week of April." After Juan left, Tom found himself studying Ruth. She continued working, apparently unbothered by his claiming her as his wife. "We're not married," he said finally. No. She hung the shovel in its place. But would you have preferred I correct you in front of your neighbor? I shouldn't have presumed. Ruth turned to face him fully. Mr. Walker, Tom, we've lived under the same roof for 11 days. I've cooked your meals, mended your clothes, tended your stock. In the eyes of your neighbors. What else would I be? Your hired woman. Your loose woman. She shook her head. I knew what assumptions would be made when I came here. Did you think I was naive? No. Tom had never thought her naive. Many things direct, practical, unsentimental, but never naive. But assuming and being are different things. Are they? Ruth pulled off her work gloves. I came here to build a life. You advertised for a wife. We're living as married people live, sharing work and shelter. The only thing missing is paper and ceremony. The challenge in her words hung in the air between them. Tom thought of the other women who'd demanded promises of immediate marriage, who'd seen it as protection or possession. Ruth spoke of it like any other practical matter, a tool needed for a specific purpose. Is that what you want? He asked. Paper and ceremony. Ruth considered. What I want is to not have to explain myself every time someone visits. What I want is the legal right to be here if something happens to you, to make decisions about this place I'm helping build. What I want, she paused, choosing words carefully, is recognition that I'm not a temporary arrangement. The rest is just process. That night, after the evening chores were done and the week calf checked, they sat by the fire again. The silence felt different now, weighted with unspoken possibilities. In town, Tom said eventually, they'll talk, mixed marriage, hasty wedding. It won't be easy. When has anything about this been easy? Ruth set aside the shirt she was patching. Tom, I've been talked about my whole life. Orphan girl, spinster, too plain for catching husbands, too educated for her station. Talk washes off like rain if you don't let it soak in. And your family, the ones back in Kansas City. A shadow crossed her face. I have a sister, married well, lives properly, sends guilty letters twice a year. She'll be horrified. Ruth's smile was thin. But then, she was horrified when I took the orphanage position. Horrified when I refused Frank Morrison. Horrified that I answered a marriage advertisement. I've disappointed her so thoroughly that one more shock won't signify. Tom understood disappointment from family. His Mexican relatives had mourned when he'd chosen ranching over the priesthood they'd wanted. His Apache relatives had watched him build fences on open land with silent reproach. The priest comes through next month, he offered. Father Miguel, he's understanding about irregular situations. Practical man. He's survived 40 years in frontier parishes. Practicality is a requirement. Ruth nodded. Next month, then, unless you need more time to consider, I know this isn't what you expected when you wrote to the agency. Tom thought of what he'd expected. Someone pretty to fill the empty spaces. Someone soft to gentle the hard edges. Someone to cook and clean and warm his bed and ask no questions. Instead, he'd gotten Ruth Collins, who asked all the questions, who made him move furniture in root cellars, who faced blizzards with the same calm she brought to sorting beans. No, he admitted, it's not what I expected. He met her steady gaze. It's better. Something shifted in Ruth's expression, too quick to name. Well then, next month, that gives us time to finish the winter preparations properly. She rose, always practical. I'll check the calf before bed. As she moved toward the door, Tom called out, Ruth? She turned. Thank you for staying through the storm. She tilted her head, that gesture he was beginning to recognize as consideration. Tom, where exactly did you think I would go into the blizzard across 40 miles of frozen desert? A hint of humor touched her mouth. Credit me with more sense than that. But they both knew she meant more than just the physical storm. She'd stayed through the storm of adjustment, of two solitary people learning to share space. She'd stayed through the discomfort of undefined relationships and unclear futures. She'd stayed when staying was neither easy nor comfortable. After she went out to the barn, Tom remained by the dying fire. In a month, Ruth Collins would become Ruth Walker. The town would gossip. His relatives on both sides would have opinions. The proper ladies would clutch their pearls at the unseemly haste. But in this house, on this night, with the memory of shared labor in his muscles and the sound of Ruth checking on animals they'd saved together, Tom found he didn't care what anyone thought. Ruth didn't want romance or rescue. She wanted partnership and purpose, after 10 years alone and 3 failed attempts at something else. Tom was beginning to think that might be enough. No, more than enough. It might be everything. The wind picked up again outside, but gentler now, clearing the last clouds from the sky. Tomorrow would bring sun and the slow work of winter's depth. But tonight, Tom Walker sat in his no longer empty house and felt something he'd thought frozen thaw a little more. Ruth Collins, with her practical soul and steady hands, was proving that some storms were worth weathering, some silences were meant to be shared, and some women came not to change a man's world, but to make it wider. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the main room. Outside, a winter wind rattled the shutters with persistent fingers, but inside the house felt secure, warm. Tom added another log, watching sparks spiral up the chimney as Ruth emerged from checking the animals one last time. "The calf's stronger," she reported, warming her hands by the flames. "Should make it through without trouble now." 3 weeks had passed since the blizzard. 3 weeks of shared work and quiet rhythms. The awkwardness of their first days had given way to something resembling ease. They moved around each other with the careful coordination of dancers learning new steps, aware, considerate, but not yet entirely natural. "Coffee," Tom offered, already reaching for the pot. "Please." Ruth settled into the chair she'd claimed as hers, the one that caught the best light for mending. "We need to talk about Father Miguel's visit." The priest was due in a week. Tom had sent word with a passing traveler, requesting the father stop for a wedding ceremony. The return message had been brief. "Will arrive Saturday next. Have witnesses ready. F.M." What about it? Tom poured coffee, black and bitter the way they both took it after supper. Ruth pulled out a small leather journal she'd been writing in lately. Practical matters. Witnesses. For one, the Sandovals. They'll come. The family had proven good neighbors, though Tom knew tongues would wag about a Mexican family witnessing a mixed marriage. "Juan can stand for me, his mother for you, if she's willing. I'll write to her tomorrow." Ruth made a note. "And the ceremony itself, I assume simple." "Father Miguel doesn't go in for elaborate ceremonies out here. Says God cares more about intention than decoration." "Good." Another note. "I'll need to clean my good dress. The gray one will have to do. Unless—" She paused, glancing at him. "Unless you'd prefer I wore something of Maria's, if she had something suitable put away." The offer stunned Tom. None of his mail-order brides would have considered wearing his first wife's clothes, much less to their own wedding. "You wouldn't mind." "Why would I mind? A dress sitting in a trunk serves no purpose." Ruth's tone was matter-of-fact, but Tom caught something else beneath it. Understanding, perhaps, of how much the gesture meant. If it would honor her memory and save the expense of new cloth, I see only good in it. Tom rose abruptly, needing movement. "I'll show you." He led her to his room, where an old trunk sat at the foot of the bed. He'd opened it only once since Maria's death, to retrieve her silver comb for burial with her. Everything else remained as she'd packed it, careful layers preserved in cedar and sage. Ruth knelt beside him as he lifted the lid. The scent of sage rose between them, sharp and clean. On top lay a dress of deep blue wool, simply made but with fine stitching at the collar and cuffs. "Her wedding dress," Tom said quietly. "Her grandmother made it." Ruth lifted it carefully, examining the work with professional interest. Beautiful stitching. Apache. Yes, the pattern at the collar. It means new beginning. He touched the design lightly. Maria translated it for me once. Then it's even more appropriate. Ruth held the dress up to herself. We're much the same size. It should need little alteration. She folded it carefully. May I? Tom nodded, throat tight. Ruth carried the dress to her room, returning for the rest a shawl, leather shoes, the small beaded bag Maria had carried. She handled each item with the same respect she'd shown Maria's preserved goods, seeing them not as relics, but as useful things waiting for purpose. When the trunk was empty, save for a few personal items Tom couldn't bear to share, Ruth sat back on her heels. Tell me about her, not the sad parts. Tell me about your life together, the daily things. So Tom talked, surprising himself with how easily the words came. He told Ruth about Maria's way with horses, how she could calm the wildest Mustang with a touch, about her silent laughter that shook her whole body, about the songs she hummed while grinding corn, melodies passed down through generations, about their first winter together, when they'd nearly starved but survived on rabbit and determination. She sounds like someone I would have liked, Ruth said when he finished. Practical, strong, not given to foolishness. You would have understood each other. Tom closed the empty trunk. She had your way of seeing what needed doing. They returned to the main room, refilled their coffee. The wind had died, leaving the kind of deep quiet that only winter brings. Ruth picked up her journal again, but didn't write, seeming to weigh words. I need to tell you something, she said finally, about the orphanage, about why I really left. Tom waited. Ruth had shared pieces of her past, but always carefully, like someone parsing out provisions for a long journey. There was a man, Mr. Garrett, on the board of directors. She stared into her coffee. He began visiting more frequently, checking on operations, he said, but his interest was specific. He'd find reasons to need me alone, comments about how a woman my age should have a protector, touches that lingered. Her jaw tightened. I rebuffed him, politely at first, then firmly. Then he suggested that my position might become uncertain without his support. Tom felt anger rise hot in his chest. He threatened you. Carefully, nothing actionable, but the meaning was clear: submit or lose everything. Ruth set down her cup with controlled precision. I'd spent 12 years building that orphanage into something good. The children depended on me, but I knew what giving in would mean, so I made my choice. You left. I secured a replacement first, a married woman whose husband's position protected her. Then I answered your advertisement. She met his eyes directly. You should know you weren't getting a noble woman fleeing for adventure. You were getting someone who chose the unknown over the unbearable. Ruth. Tom leaned forward. Any man who'd use power that way is no man at all. You did what you had to do. I ran. The words came out bitter. 30 children who trusted me, and I ran. You survived. Tom thought of his own choices, the times he'd had to pick between bad and worse. And you made sure they were cared for before you left. That's not running, that's strategic retreat. Ruth's smile was small, but real. Strategic retreat. I like that better. She picked up her journal again, turning to a fresh page. So, a week from Saturday. We'll need supplies from town before then. The change of subject was abrupt, but necessary. Tom recognized the need to step back from difficult revelations, to return to practical ground. I'll go tomorrow. Give me a list. They spent the next hour planning like generals preparing for campaign. Ruth needed flour, sugar, basic supplies for a wedding meal. Nothing elaborate, she insisted on that, but something to mark the occasion. Tom would also stop at the bank, adding Ruth's name to his accounts. That's not necessary yet, Ruth protested. It is. Tom was firm. You're right about legal recognition. If something happens to me between now and Saturday, you need protection." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Practical, thank you." As they prepared for bed, Tom found himself watching her movements with new awareness. Not desire, though that was beginning to stir in ways that surprised him, but recognition. Ruth Collins had chosen him not from romance or desperation, but from calculation. She'd weighed her options and decided a hard life with an honest man beat a comfortable life with dishonest ones. He could respect that. More than respect. He could match it with his own practical honor. "Ruth," he called as she headed to her room. She turned, lamplight catching the silver threads in her dark hair. "What you told me about Garrett. It doesn't change anything except to make me think better of your courage." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. Thank you, Tom. Good night." After she'd gone, Tom stood in the dark kitchen looking out at the star-scattered sky. In a week, he'd marry a woman he barely knew, a woman who'd claimed his first wife's dress and his daily routine with equal practicality. A woman who shared his appreciation for silence and work, who faced hardship without flinching, who'd chosen him from necessity but stayed from growing conviction. It wasn't the stuff of romance novels. There were no flowers or poetry, no protestations of devotion. Just two people building something useful from the materials at hand, but standing there in the darkness of his soon-to-be shared home. Tom thought perhaps that was better than romance. Romance faded with hardship. What he and Ruth were building might actually last. The calf lowed from the barn, and Tom heard Ruth's door open, her feet padding toward the sound. She'd said she'd take the night checks, and she meant it. He listened to her movements, efficient even in darkness, and felt something settle in his chest. Next Saturday, Ruth Collins would become Ruth Walker. The town would gossip. The relatives would judge, and none of it would matter, because in this house, on this land, two practical people were creating something that worked. Not a fairy tale, not a grand passion, but a partnership built on shared labor and mutual respect. Tom headed to his own bed, already planning tomorrow's trip to town. He'd add coffee to Ruth's list, the good kind, not the cheap substitute he usually bought. A woman who got up at night to check calves deserved decent coffee. It wasn't romance, but it was consideration. And sometimes, in the hard lands of New Mexico territory, consideration was its own kind of love. The week passed in a blur of preparations. Ruth transformed the house with subtle touches. Not decorations exactly, but a thorough cleaning that made everything shine with quiet dignity. She mended the good tablecloth, polished the few pieces of silver, arranged dried flowers from her carefully preserved collection in a simple jar. Tom watched her work with growing appreciation. She approached their wedding like any other task requiring attention, methodically, without sentiment, but with a perfectionist's eye for detail. When he offered to help, she put him to work without ceremony. "The chairs need tightening," she said, handing him tools. "We can't have Senora Sandoval wobbling during the ceremony." They worked side by side, preparing for an event that would fundamentally change their lives with the same matter-of-fact cooperation they brought to daily chores. It should have felt strange. Instead, it felt like an extension of everything they'd already built. Friday evening found them sitting at the newly polished table, going over final details. Ruth had Maria's dress hanging in her room, altered now to fit perfectly. She'd spent hours on the modifications, her stitches so careful they seemed to disappear into the original work. "The Sandovals will arrive early to help," Ruth reported, checking her list. "Mrs. Sandoval insisted on bringing food. I tried to refuse, but—" "You don't refuse Maria Sandoval's food," Tom finished. She'd be insulted. "That's what Juan said. He also mentioned his cousin Pablo plays guitar. Would music be appropriate?" Tom considered. Maria would have liked it. Music was important to her. Ruth nodded, making a note. They'd developed this rhythm over the past weeks. She'd raise questions. He'd provide context. They'd decide together. It was, Tom realized, how married people actually communicated, regardless of ceremonies. Tom, Ruth set down her pencil. I need to ask, after tomorrow, what are your expectations? The directness shouldn't have surprised him anymore, but this topic carried weight. What do you mean? We'll be legally married, man and wife in the eyes of God and law. She met his gaze steadily. I need to know what that means to you, in practical terms. Tom felt heat rise in his neck, but matched her directness. I won't demand anything you're not ready to give, if that's what you're asking. That's part of it. Ruth folded her hands, choosing words carefully. I'm not a young woman. Tom, I'm not ignorant of what marriage entails, but neither am I romantic about it. If we're to be truly married, I'd rather we approach that aspect, as we have everything else, with honesty and consideration. Agreed. Tom found her frankness refreshing after the fumbling negotiations of his youth. We'll find our way. No rush, no assumptions. Ruth relaxed slightly. Good. Then we understand each other. She stood, began clearing the table. Father Miguel arrives tomorrow afternoon. We should both try to sleep. But sleep proved elusive. Tom lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, aware that tomorrow everything would change. Not dramatically. Ruth would still rise early to make coffee. He'd still check the stock. They'd still work side by side, but there would be a permanence to it, a recognition that what they were building had formal shape. He thought of Maria, wondered what she would think of this practical union. She'd been practical herself. Hadn't married him for love initially, but for protection. Her family nervous about a young Apache woman alone. Love had come later, growing from shared work and quiet understanding. Perhaps it could happen again. Perhaps it was already happening. In small ways he was only beginning to recognize. Morning dawned clear and cold. Tom found Ruth already up, bread baking, coffee ready. She wore her everyday dress, but her hair was newly washed, braided more carefully than usual. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Too much to do, but there was a tension in her shoulders that suggested otherwise. I've never been married before. Never even been asked, except for Frank Morrison, and that was more business proposition than proposal. Having doubts, Ruth turned from the stove to face him fully. No. Are you? No. Tom realized it was true. Whatever this marriage would become, he didn't doubt the rightness of it. We suit each other. Yes. Ruth's smile was small but genuine. We do. The morning passed in a flurry of final preparations. Tom heated water for baths, shaved more carefully than usual, put on his one good suit. Through the thin walls, he could hear Ruth moving in her room, the rustle of fabric, the soft humming she sometimes did when concentrating. The Sandovals arrived at midday, their wagon loaded with more food than 10 people could eat. Maria Sandoval, a comfortable woman with a silver threading her black hair, took charge immediately. Dios mío, you are going to serve beans at your wedding. She clicked her tongue at Ruth. No, I have pozole, tamales, fresh tortillas, and wedding cookies, polvorones. Every wedding needs sweetness. Ruth accepted the invasion of her kitchen with good grace, even joining in the preparation. Tom watched from the doorway as the two women worked, Maria chattering in a mix of Spanish and English, Ruth asking questions about spices and techniques. Within an hour, they moved together like old friends. Ruth's reserve thawing under Maria's warm assault. She's good for you, Juan said quietly, joining Tom on the porch. Not like the others. No, Tom agreed. Nothing like the others. My mother was worried when we heard about another mail-order bride. The last one. Juan shook his head. But this one, she's different. She looks at the land like someone who understands it. Father Miguel arrived as the sun passed its peak, his mule laden with saddlebags and an expression of patient endurance. He was a small man, weathered like old leather, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Thomas," he greeted, dismounting with a grunt. "Another wedding." "The last one," Tom promised. "I've heard that before." But the priest was smiling. "Where is the bride?" Ruth emerged from the house, still in her work dress but with flour dusting her hands. She approached the priest directly. No simpering or false modesty. "Father Miguel, I'm Ruth Collins. Thank you for coming." The priest studied her with those knowing eyes. "You're not what I expected." "Nor you," Ruth replied calmly. "I thought priests were supposed to be tall and imposing." Father Miguel laughed, a rusty sound. "And I thought mail-order brides were supposed to be young and foolish. It seems we're both wrong." He glanced between them. "This might actually work." As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ruth disappeared to change. Maria Sandoval went to help, leaving the men to arrange the main room for the ceremony. It was a simple setup, chairs in a semicircle, the table cleared to serve as an altar, candles lit despite the daylight. When Ruth emerged, Tom's breath caught. Maria's dress fit her perfectly, the deep blue wool complementing her coloring. She'd left her hair in its braid but had woven in small white flowers from the hardy plant that grew by the spring. The Apache collar design seemed to glow in the candlelight. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something about her, the straight spine, the calm face, the way she wore Maria's dress without apology or comparison. That made beauty irrelevant. She looked like what she was, a woman who knew her own mind and had chosen her path. "Well," she said, smoothing the skirt with steady hands. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was brief. Father Miguel had adapted to frontier necessities, cutting the service to its essential bones. Tom and Ruth stood before the makeshift altar, the Sandovals serving as witnesses, Pablo's guitar providing soft accompaniment. "Do you, Thomas Walker, take this woman as your lawful wife?" "I do." "Do you, Ruth Collins, take this man as your lawful husband?" "I do." The rings were simple bands Tom had bought in town. Nothing fancy, but solid gold that would last. Ruth's hands were steady as he slipped the ring on her finger, her touch warm as she returned the gesture. "Then, by the power vested in me by God and the territory of New Mexico, I pronounce you man and wife." There was a moment's pause. Tom knew he should kiss her, that it was expected, but Ruth solved the problem by stepping forward and placing a brief, firm kiss on his cheek. It was perfectly proper, avoiding awkwardness while acknowledging the moment. "Well," Father Miguel said with another rusty laugh, "that's done. Now, I believe Senora Sandoval mentioned food." The rest faded into a blur of congratulations and cooking smells. Maria Sandoval had indeed brought enough food for an army. They ate pozole and tamales, the wedding cookies crumbling sweet on the tongue. Pablo played his guitar, old Spanish songs that made his mother wipe her eyes. Ruth moved through it all with quiet grace, accepting good wishes, helping serve food, making sure everyone's cup was filled. She caught Tom's eye occasionally, small smiles of shared understanding passing between them. This was their wedding, but it was also a community event, binding them not just to each other but to this place and these people. As evening fell, the Sandovals prepared to leave. Maria embraced Ruth warmly, whispering something that made Ruth's eyes brighten with unshed tears. Juan shook Tom's hand, man to man, while Pablo packed his guitar. Father Miguel was last to go, his mule protesting the journey ahead. He blessed them both, then paused. "I've married many couples," he said quietly. "The ones who last aren't always the ones who start with passion. Sometimes it's the ones who start with honesty." He glanced between them. "You two might just make it." Then they were alone, Mr. and Mrs. Walker. standing in their doorway watching the last light fade from the sky. The house behind them was theirs now. Officially. Legally. The work ahead was theirs to share. "So," Ruth said finally, "we're married." "We are." She turned to look at him. This woman who was now his wife. "I should start cleaning up." "Tomorrow," Tom said firmly. "Tonight we just be—" Ruth considered, then nodded. They went inside together, into the house that was now officially home to them both. The candles still flickered on the table, casting warm light over the remains of their wedding feast. It wasn't grand or romantic, but it was real, and it was theirs. And for two practical people building a life in hard country, that was more than enough. It was everything. The candles burned low as Tom and Ruth sat in their quiet house, the wedding guests gone. The festivities ended. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their cries carrying on the cold night air. Ruth had changed from Maria's wedding dress back into her everyday clothes, but she'd kept the small white flowers in her braid. "More coffee?" she asked, already rising. Even on her wedding night, the practical patterns held. "No," Tom caught her hand gently. "Sit with me a while." She looked at their joined hands with mild surprise, but settled back into her chair. They'd touched during work-passing tools, steadying loads. But this was different, intentional. "It was a good day," Ruth said after a moment. "The Sandovals were very kind. They're good people." Tom didn't release her hand. Testing. She didn't pull away. "Maria Sandoval said something to you when she was leaving." Ruth's fingers tightened slightly in his. "She said Maria, your Maria, would be glad to see her dress worn again. That houses need life in them, or they forget how to shelter love." The words hung between them like smoke from the dying candles. Tom thought of all the nights he'd sat in this same spot alone, the house around him solid but empty, functioning but not alive. "Ruth," he began, then stopped. "How did you thank someone for bringing life back to dead spaces? How did you explain that her presence, unsentimental, practical, steady, had changed the very air in the rooms?" "I know," she said simply. "I feel it too, the difference." She turned her hand in his, palm to palm. "We should talk about tonight, about expectations." Tom had known this conversation would come. Ruth approached everything head on, and marriage would be no different. "There's no rush. We have time to adjust." "Do we?" Ruth met his eyes directly. "Tom, I'm 30 years old. You're 35. We're not young people with endless seasons ahead. If we're to build something more than a working partnership, shouldn't we be honest about that too?" The frankness should have been shocking. Instead, Tom found it liberating. No games, no pretense, just truth between two people who'd chosen each other for reasons deeper than passion. "What do you want?" "Ruth, honestly." She considered, her free hand absently adjusting the flowers in her hair. "I want what we've been building to grow. I want—" She paused, choosing words. "I've spent my whole life taking care of other people's children, living in other people's spaces. I want my own life, my own family, my own purpose that isn't borrowed or temporary." Her gaze was steady. "Is that something you want too, or did you just need a housekeeper who wouldn't run?" The question stung because it held truth. Tom had written to that agency wanting someone to fill an empty space, to cook and clean and make the loneliness less sharp. But Ruth had become something else entirely. Partner, companion. The person who understood without words why he checked certain fence lines more often. Who saw the value in Maria's grinding stones. Who faced blizzards and isolation with calm acceptance. "At first," he admitted, "maybe I did just want someone who'd stay, but now—" He squeezed her hand. "Now I want the life you're talking about. The real life. Not just the appearance of it." Ruth studied his face in the candlelight, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. "Then perhaps we should stop sitting here like strangers." She stood, not releasing his hand, and Tom rose with her. There was a moment of awkwardness. Two people who'd shared space for weeks suddenly navigating new territory. Then Ruth stepped closer, reaching up to touch his face with her free hand. "I'm not a romantic woman," she said quietly. "I don't need pretty words or grand gestures. But I am your wife now, and I'd like to be that in truth, not just in law." Tom covered her hand with his own, feeling the calluses from work, the strength in her fingers. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since the storm," she admitted. "Since you accepted my help with the fence lines. Since you trusted me with Maria's things. Since you saw me as myself, not as some idea of what a woman should be." He kissed her then, not the brief peck of the ceremony, but something real. Ruth responded with the same directness she brought to everything. No games, no pretense, just honest feeling. When they parted, her cheeks were flushed, but her eyes remained steady. "Well," she said, slightly breathless, "that's settled then." Despite the serious words, Tom found himself smiling. "You negotiate everything like this." "Only the important things." But she was almost smiling too. "Should we—" She gestured toward the bedrooms. "My room's larger," Tom offered, then felt heat rise in his face. "That is, it has more space, for your things." "Practical," Ruth agreed, but there was warmth in her voice. "I'll need a few minutes." While she disappeared into her room, Tom banked the fire and blew out the remaining candles. His hands shook slightly as he performed the nightly tasks. He'd been married before, but this felt different. With Maria, youth and passion had carried them forward. With Ruth, every step was conscious, deliberate, chosen. He was already in bed when she knocked softly on the door. His door. Their door now. "Come in." She entered wearing a plain nightgown, her hair unbraided and falling past her shoulders. Tom had never seen it down before. It changed her face, softened it, though her expression remained composed. "I haven't done this before," she said simply, standing by the door. "Been a wife. If I do something wrong—" "Ruth." Tom held out his hand. "Come here." She came to the bed, sitting carefully on the edge. "I know the basics. The matron at the orphanage was very frank about marital duties, but knowing and doing are different things." "It's not a duty," Tom said firmly. "Not between us? We're partners. Remember in this too." Something eased in Ruth's shoulders. She slid under the quilts, staying on her side of the bed at first. They lay there in the darkness, aware of each other, the space between them feeling both vast and very small. "Tom," Ruth's voice was quiet. "I'm glad it's you. I'm glad I answered your letter." He reached across the space, finding her hand. "So am I." They moved together then, slowly, carefully, with the same patient attention they brought to shared work. There was awkwardness, but there was also tenderness, discovery, the building of something new between two people who'd thought themselves past such possibilities. Afterward, Ruth lay with her head on Tom's shoulder, one hand resting over his heart. The house settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs, but it felt different now. Fuller, more complete. "The cousins will need moving next week," Ruth said drowsily. "Down from the high pasture." Tom chuckled, the sound rumbling under her ear. "You're thinking about cattle now." "I always think about what needs doing." She shifted closer. "But I was also thinking, this is nice, being here, being married." A pause. Being not alone. "Yes," Tom agreed, stroking her loosened hair. "It is." They dozed, woke, talked in whispers about nothing important, the need for new harness leather, whether to expand the garden come spring, the way snow patterns predicted water availability. Ordinary things, but shared now in the darkness of their marriage bed. They became intimate. "I should tell you," Ruth said as dawn approached. "I want children. If God wills it. I know I'm old for it, but—" "You're not old," Tom interrupted. "And yes, If it happens, yes. It might not at my age. And with the hard life here, then we'll have each other. And the ranch, and the life we're building. He pulled her closer. That's already more than I had alone. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then, Maria would have been a good mother. Yes, Tom's throat tightened. She would have. I'm sorry you lost that chance with her. So am I. But Ruth. He waited until she looked up at him. I'm not sorry about this. About us, it's different, but it's good. It's real. She studied his face in the gray pre-dawn light, then nodded. Yeah, it's real. They rose together as the first light touched the windows, dressing with the casual intimacy of a couple who'd crossed an important bridge. Ruth braided her hair. Tom shaved, both preparing for the day's work as they had every morning. But there were small differences. A brief touch in passing, a shared smile over coffee, an ease that hadn't been there before. What's first today? Ruth asked, consulting her ever-present list. Fence repairs in the south pasture. That storm damaged more than I thought. I'll come. You can teach me the proper repairs you mentioned. She packed food without being asked, filled water jugs, gathered the tools they'd need. And this afternoon, I want to start planning the garden expansion. If we're to have a family, we'll need better food stores. The way she said family, careful but hopeful, made something twist in Tom's chest. He caught her hand as she passed, pulled her close for a moment. We're already a family, he said against her hair. You and me. Whatever else comes is extra blessing. Ruth leaned into him, allowing the moment of softness before straightening. The fence won't repair itself. No, Tom agreed, releasing her. It won't. They worked that day as they had many others, side by side under the winter sun. But there was a new dimension to their partnership, an awareness that went beyond the practical. When their hands touched passing tools, it meant something more. When they paused to share water, the silence held different weight. That night, Ruth came to their bed without knocking, as if she'd always belonged there. They talked in the darkness about the day's work and tomorrow's plans, but also about hopes, possibilities, the future they were building nail by nail, season by season. I never expected this, Ruth admitted as sleep pulled at them. When I left Kansas City, I thought I was choosing survival over destruction. I didn't think I was choosing happiness. Are you happy? Tom asked, genuinely curious. Ruth wasn't given to emotional declarations. She considered, I'm useful. I'm building something that matters. I have a partner who sees me as I am. She turned to face him in the darkness. Yes, I'm happy. Are you? Tom thought of his empty years, the failed attempts at filling the void Maria had left, the resignation he'd worn like a coat. Then he thought of Ruth checking fences, making coffee before dawn, wearing Maria's dress without apology, coming to his bed with honest desire. Yes, he said simply, I'm happy. They slept then, curved together against the cold, while outside the coyotes sang and the wind tested the shutters and the land waited for spring. In the house Tom had built with his first love and rebuilt with his second. Two practical people rested in the knowledge that they'd chosen well. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better, a real beginning, earned through work and honesty, sealed with promises they both intended to keep. The letter from Kansas City arrived on a Tuesday morning in late February, carried by a passing freight hauler who'd picked it up in Silver Creek. Ruth was in the garden plot, turning soil in preparation for spring planting, when Tom brought it to her. She recognized the handwriting immediately. My sister, she said, wiping dirt from her hands before taking the envelope. Her face, normally so composed, showed a flicker of apprehension. I'll give you privacy, Tom offered, but Ruth shook her head. No, we're married. Her words concern you too. She broke the seal with steady fingers, though Tom noticed she took a breath before unfolding the pages. The letter was long, written in the same careful hand as the address. Ruth read silently, her expression growing more set with each line. Finally, she handed it to Tom. "You should see what she says." The sister Mrs. Margaret Fleming of Kansas City had opinions, many opinions, about Ruth's shocking decision to answer a marriage advertisement, about the unseemly haste of the wedding, about the degradation of marrying a man of mixed blood who lived beyond the bounds of civilization. The phrases dripped with the kind of genteel horror that managed to wound while maintaining perfect grammar. "She wants you to come home," Tom said, reaching the final paragraph. "Says her husband will pay for your passage and find you respectable employment." Respectable? Ruth's laugh was bitter. Like Mr. Garrett was respectable. She took the letter back, folded it carefully. She never understood why I worked at the orphanage. Thought it beneath our family's standing, such as it was. Now this. She gestured at the ranch. Herself? Everything? This must seem like complete apostasy. They were sitting on the porch steps now, the morning sun warming the boards. Tom wanted to comfort her, but wasn't sure how. Ruth didn't seem like a woman who accepted easy comfort. "Will you write back?" he asked instead. "I have to. If I don't, she'll assume I'm being held against my will and probably send the authorities." Ruth picked at a splinter in the step. "I'll tell her the truth, that I'm married by choice, that I'm happy, that I have no intention of leaving." She won't believe it. "No," Ruth agreed. "But I'll have done my duty by telling her." That afternoon, while Tom worked on repairing the chicken coop roof, Ruth composed her response. He could see her through the window, bent over the paper, writing and crossing out, choosing each word with care. When she finished, she brought it to him. "Read it," she said. "Tell me if it's too harsh." The letter was Ruth at her most controlled. "Dear Margaret, I received your letter of January 15th. I understand your concerns, but I must correct several misapprehensions. My husband is a successful rancher, well respected in his community, his heritage, which seems to trouble you greatly, troubles me not at all. He is an honest man who works hard and treats me with consideration and respect. You ask me to think of our family's reputation. I ask you to think of my happiness. For the first time in my life, I have a true home, meaningful work, and a partner who values my contributions. I wake each morning with purpose. I sleep each night in peace. Your offer of rescue, while perhaps kindly meant, is neither needed nor wanted. I am not a captive to be freed, but a wife who chose her husband and her life with full knowledge and genuine contentment. I hope that in time you can accept my choice. Until then, know that I am well, safe, and building a good life here in New Mexico territory. Your sister, Ruth Walker." "It's perfect," Tom said, handing it back. "Firm, but not cruel." "She'll hate that I signed it Ruth Walker?" Ruth almost smiled. "She'll hate everything about it, actually, but it needed saying." The next morning brought new challenges that pushed thoughts of disapproving sisters aside. 3 of Tom's cattle had broken through a fence in the night, wandering onto land claimed by a newcomer named Josiah Briggs. Tom had heard about Briggs in town, a hard man from Texas who'd bought the old Hartman place and had strong opinions about property lines. "I'll ride over," Tom said, saddling his horse. "Apologize, collect the cattle, offer to repair any damage." "I'm coming with you," Ruth announced, already changing into her riding clothes. "Ruth, Briggs might not be welcoming to either of us. All the more reason for 2 instead of 1. She emerged, dressed and determined. "Partners. Remember." They rode together across the morning landscape, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The Briggs ranch was smaller than Tom's, but positioned on good water. The man himself stood waiting by his gate, rifle prominent but not quite pointed. "Walker," Briggs said, his accent pure Texas drawl. His pale eyes flicked to Ruth, narrowed slightly. This your squaw." Tom felt Ruth stiffen beside him, but her voice remained level. "I'm Mrs. Walker. You must be Mr. Briggs. Welcome to the valley." Briggs ignored her, addressing Tom. "Your cattle trampled my garden plot, 3 head branded with your mark." "I apologize," Tom said evenly. "The fence failed in last week's wind. I'll repair any damage and reinforce the fence line." "Money compensation would be better." Briggs named a figure 3 times what any damage could reasonably cost. "That seems excessive," Ruth said before Tom could respond. "Perhaps we could assess the actual damage." Briggs's face darkened. "I don't discuss business with women, especially not—" He bit off whatever insult he'd been about to deliver, but his meaning was clear. "Mr. Briggs." Tom's voice had gone very quiet, which Ruth had learned meant danger. "My wife speaks for our ranch as much as I do. You'll address her with respect, or we'll handle this matter through the territorial marshal." No need for threats, but Briggs backed down slightly. $20 for the damage. "After we see it," Ruth insisted. The garden plot turned out to be a small patch of turned earth with no plantings yet. The cattle had churned the soil but done no real harm. Ruth knelt, examining the ground with the same attention she gave everything. "This is actually better for planting," she observed. "The cattle have worked compost into the soil, but we'll smooth it for you, and Tom will reinforce the fence. That seems fair compensation." Briggs clearly wanted to argue, but faced with Ruth's calm logic and Tom's steady presence, he subsided. They spent 2 hours repairing the imaginary damage, Ruth working alongside Tom while Briggs watched with barely concealed displeasure. "Don't come back," Briggs said as they prepared to leave with the wayward cattle. "Next time I find your stock on my land, I'll shoot them." "Understood," Tom said coolly. "Though neighbors here generally try to work together, you might find that approach serves better in the long run." They rode home in thoughtful silence. "Finally," Ruth said. "He's going to be trouble." "Yes, men like him always are." Tom glanced at her. "You handled that well. Some women would have let his rudeness drive them off." "Some women haven't spent 12 years managing donors who thought orphans were barely human." Ruth's smile was grim. "Mr. Briggs is unpleasant but manageable, though we should reinforce all the fence lines on that border. We'll start tomorrow." That evening, as they ate dinner, Ruth seemed preoccupied. Finally, she said, "What he called me, squaw. That's happened before, hasn't it, with your other wives?" Tom set down his fork. "Charlotte cried for hours the first time someone said it. Margaret pretended not to hear. Sarah," he paused. "Sarah said worse things herself when she was angry. And Maria would look at them with pity. She said people who needed to make others small must feel very small themselves." Tom studied Ruth across the table. "It doesn't bother you?" "Oh, it bothers me." Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact. "But not because I'm ashamed. It bothers me because it's meant to diminish you, to make our marriage seem less valid, as if their approval matters to what we've built. Most people need that approval." "I'm not most people." Ruth rose to clear the dishes. "And neither are you. Or you'd have moved to town years ago, tried to pass as fully Mexican or fully white, made yourself acceptable." She paused at the wash basin. "Instead, you stayed here, on this land. Yourself. That takes strength. Or stubbornness. Those aren't always different things." She began washing dishes with her usual efficiency. "The Sandovals don't treat us like Briggs does." "No, but they're the exception." "Then we'll find more exceptions, or make do with our own company." Ruth handed him a plate to dry. "I didn't come here for social acceptance, Tom. I came here for a life that mattered. That hasn't changed because one unpleasant man said an ugly word." Later, as they prepared for bed, Tom found himself watching Ruth brush out her hair. still thinking about the day's encounters. His previous wives had expected him to shield them from the harsh realities of frontier prejudice. Ruth faced it head-on, analyzing it like any other problem to be solved or endured. "My sister would say Briggs proved her point," Ruth said, catching his gaze in the small mirror. "That I've degraded myself, exposed myself to insult." "What would you say back?" Ruth considered. "That I've exposed myself to life, real life, with real challenges and real rewards. Not the safe, small existence she thinks I should want." She set down the brush, turned to face him. "Today was difficult, but tonight I'm here, in my own home, with my chosen husband. Tomorrow we'll strengthen fence lines and tend our land. That's victory, not degradation." In bed, they came together with an intensity born of the day's challenges. Afterward, lying quiet in the darkness, Ruth said, "I want you to teach me to shoot. Properly, I mean, not just the basics." Tom tensed slightly. "Because of Briggs?" "Because of the world. You won't always be with me when trouble comes. I need to be able to defend what's ours." She found his hand under the quilt. "Will you teach me?" "Yes, we'll start tomorrow." "Good." She shifted closer. "Tom, thank you for standing up for me today, for making him acknowledge me." "You're my wife," Tom said simply. "Disrespect to you is disrespect to me, to us." Still, other men might have let it pass to avoid conflict. "I'm not other men." "No," Ruth agreed, and there was something warm in her voice. "You're not." They slept then, while outside the wind tested their fence lines and coyotes prowled the boundaries of their land. In the morning, there would be more work fences to strengthen, skills to learn, challenges to meet. But tonight, in their bed earned through choice and determination, Tom and Ruth Walker rested in the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. Not because they were romantic souls bound by passion, but because they were practical people who'd found in each other a matching strength. And in the harsh landscape of New Mexico territory, strength mattered more than approval, partnership more than propriety. Let Margaret Fleming clutch her pearls in Kansas City. Let Josiah Briggs mutter his slurs. Here, in this house built on work and trust, two people were crafting something that would endure longer than gossip or prejudice. They were building a life, and they would defend it, together, against all comers. Spring arrived slowly in the high country, first as a softening of the wind, then as tiny green shoots pushing through the last snow. Ruth had thrown herself into planning the expanded garden with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything. Charts covered the kitchen table, planting schedules, water requirements, companion planting strategies she'd learned from the Sandoval women. "Corn here," she explained to Tom one evening, pointing at her detailed map. "Beans to climb the stalks, squash between for ground cover. The Apache way, like your mother taught you." "The three sisters," Tom confirmed, touched that she'd remembered his brief mention of his mother's gardening methods. "But this is ambitious. Ruth, 3 times what we planted last year. We'll need it." She kept her eyes on the plans, but Tom caught the slight flush on her cheeks. When our family grows, better to prepare now than scramble later." They'd been married 4 months. Each passing cycle that didn't bring the hoped-for news cast a shadow across Ruth's face. Though she never spoke of disappointment directly, Tom had found her once, standing by Maria's grave on the hill, not praying but simply standing, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach. "Time yet," he'd said quietly, joining her. "Less time than younger women have," she'd replied, but leaned into his offered embrace. Now, watching her plan for a future that might never come, Tom felt that familiar ache. But he said only, "We'll need to clear more land. That scrub area by the eastern fence might work." "I thought so too. And Mrs. Sandoval says her nephew Miguel is looking for work. We could hire him for the heavy clearing." It was discussions like these, practical, forward-looking, that marked their days. But the arrival of Tom's cousin, James Walking Bear, marked a shift in their carefully ordered life. James appeared on a Thursday afternoon, riding a spotted pony in the Apache way, his appearance sending the chickens squawking. Tom was in the far pasture, but Ruth was home, working on preserving the last of the winter stores. She heard the horse, grabbed the rifle Tom had been teaching her to use, and stepped onto the porch. The rider pulled up, hands visible and empty. "I'm looking for Tom Walker," he said in accented English. "I'm his cousin, James." Ruth lowered the rifle but kept it ready. Tom had mentioned Apache relatives but said they rarely visited. "He's working the east pasture. You're welcome to wait." James dismounted with fluid grace, and Ruth got her first clear look at him. He was younger than Tom, perhaps 30, with the same sharp cheekbones but dressed in a mixture of Apache and Mexican clothing. His dark eyes studied her with frank curiosity. "You're the new wife," he said. It wasn't a question.
"The one who stayed."
"I'm Ruth Walker, and yes, I stayed." She set the rifle aside, but within reach. "Would you like water food?" James's smile was quick and surprised.
"The others wouldn't have asked. They were afraid."
"I've found fear rarely improves situations." Ruth brought water in a clay cup, fresh bread with preserves. "Tom should be back within the hour." James ate neatly, watching her work. "You're different," he said finally. "Tom wrote that you were, but I had to see." "He wrote to you." "To our grandmother. She lives with the people still, up in the sacred mountains. She wanted to know if this marriage was true or just another attempt to fill empty space." Ruth considered this. "What will you tell her?" "The truth, that you move in this space like you belong here, that you don't jump when an Apache appears at your door." He paused. "That you might last." When Tom returned, the reunion was restrained but warm. The cousins spoke in a mixture of English and Apache that Ruth couldn't follow, but she read the emotion in their gestures, the careful respect between men who'd chosen different paths. At dinner, James told them why he'd come. "There's trouble brewing. White settlers pushing into the reserved lands. The army says they'll enforce the boundaries, but..." He shrugged eloquently. "There's always trouble," Tom said quietly. "What's different now? Now there's talk of moving the people again, further south, to worse land." James's face hardened. "Some of the young men speak of fighting. Others say we should accept, adapt. Grandmother thinks you might have influence. Your name carries weight with the territorial officials." Ruth watched Tom's face close off. "I chose this life," he said carefully. "I can't speak for the people." "You are the people," James countered. "Mixed blood doesn't erase that." The argument that followed was polite but intense. Ruth understood she was witnessing an old wound. Tom's position between worlds, claimed by both, fully accepted by neither. When James finally bedded down in the barn, refusing the house, the tension lingered. "He's right, you know," Ruth said as they prepared for bed. "You do have influence you don't use." Tom's movements were sharp as he undressed. "And say what? That they should accept being pushed onto worse land, that they should fight and die. I have no good answers." "Ruth."
"Maybe there aren't any good answers, just less bad ones."
She touched his arm, gentling him like she would a spooked horse.
"But refusing to engage doesn't make the problem disappear. You think I should get involved?"
"I think you should follow your conscience. But hiding here, pretending you're not who you are, that's not the man I married." Tom turned to face her fully.
"The man you married is a rancher."
"Nothing more."
"The man I married,"
Ruth said steadily,
"is someone who understands this land and its people in ways others don't, who bridges worlds even when he'd rather not, who has the strength to stand in the middle and speak truth to both sides."
They went to bed without resolving the question, but Ruth felt the turmoil in Tom's restlessness. Near dawn, she woke to find his side of the bed empty. Through the window,
She could see him talking with James by the corral, their voices low but animated. When he came back to bed, smelling of cold air and decision, Ruth asked, "What will you do?" "Ride to Fort Union. Speak with Colonel Morrison. He's not the worst of them. Maybe I can make him understand what another forced relocation would mean." Tom's laugh was bitter. "Use my influence, as James says." "I'll come with you." "Ruth, no. It's a hard ride, and the fort isn't a place for women." Ruth sat up. "Tom Walker, we've discussed this. Partners means partners. Besides," she added practically, "a married man arguing for family stability carries more weight than a bachelor. They need to see what you're protecting." Tom studied her in the gray light. "You've thought about this?" "I think about everything." She touched his face. "Your cousin is right. You can't hide from who you are, but you don't have to face it alone anymore." The trip to Fort Union took 2 days. James accompanied them part way, splitting off to return to his grandmother with news of Tom's involvement. Ruth had never traveled so far from the ranch since arriving, and the journey tested her growing frontier skills. At night, camping under stars so bright they seemed touchable, Tom told her more about his divided heritage, about summers with his Apache relatives, learning to read sign and track game, about winters in Mexican settlements, attending mass and memorizing prayers, about always being too much one thing for the other side. "Maria understood," he said, banking their small fire. "She lived it too, but after she died, I thought it easier to just step back, be neither." "Easier isn't always right," Ruth observed, checking the loads in her rifle as he'd taught her. "And you can't be neither. You're both. That's what gives your voice weight." Fort Union sprawled across the plain like a small city, all adobe walls and military precision. Ruth had never seen so many soldiers in one place. They stared at the mixed couple, the half-breed rancher and his stern-faced white wife. But Tom's name got them an audience with Colonel Morrison. The colonel was a weathered man in his 50s, with keen eyes that missed nothing. He studied Ruth with particular interest. "Mrs. Walker, I'd heard Tom had married again." His tone was neutral, professional. "Welcome to Fort Union." "Thank you, Colonel. I hope our visit isn't inconvenient." "Not at all, though I suspect I know why you're here." He turned to Tom. "The relocation rumors." "They're not rumors if your men are already surveying new boundaries," Tom said evenly. What followed was an hour of careful negotiation. Tom argued with quiet passion about the importance of stable territories, about the promises already broken, about the danger of pushing desperate people to desperate actions. Ruth added her own observations about the false economy of constant relocation, the waste of resources, the human cost calculated in practical terms the military mind could grasp. "You make compelling arguments," Morrison said finally. "But the pressure from Washington and the new settlers is intense. I'm one voice among many." "One voice with boots on the ground," Tom countered. "Your reports carry weight. Tell them the truth, that another relocation will cost more in blood and treasury than keeping the current boundaries." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll do what I can. No promises. But I'll add my concerns to the official record." He stood, extending his hand to Tom. "You've grown into your father's diplomatic skills. He'd be proud." As they prepared to leave, Morrison stopped Ruth. "Ma'am, a word." She waited while Tom stepped outside. "Your husband walks a difficult line," Morrison said quietly. "There are those who see his influence with both sides as a threat. Watch his back." "I always do, Colonel." The ride home was subdued, both of them aware they'd done what they could, but uncertain if it would matter. As they crested the final ridge and saw their ranch spread below, Ruth felt the familiar settling in her chest. Home. "You did well," she told Tom as they unsaddled the horses. "Whatever comes, you stood up." "We stood up," he corrected. "Your arguments about resources hit harder than any of mine."
That night, as they lay in their bed, Ruth felt the subtle flutter in her belly she'd been noticing for days but hadn't dared acknowledge. She caught Tom's hand, placed it low on her stomach.
"Tom," she whispered, "I think I might be—"
His hand stilled, then spread wide across her belly.
"Are you sure?"
Not completely, but the signs, I think so. In the darkness, she felt rather than saw his smile.
"Our family grows."
If God wills it. Old habits of caution died hard. It's early yet. Anything could happen. Yes, Tom agreed, but his hand remained protective over the potential new life. But right now, tonight, there's hope. Ruth thought about the day, about standing in a military fort, arguing Indian policy, while possibly carrying a child who would embody all the complexities of this frontier, about the challenges that child would face, the worlds it would have to navigate.
"Are you afraid?"
she asked Tom.
"Terrified,"
he admitted, but also grateful to have this chance again, to build something new from all these broken pieces. Ruth covered his hand with hers.
"We'll teach them to be bridges,"
she said softly. Like their father, strong enough to span different worlds. Like their mother, Tom added, brave enough to cross them. Outside, coyotes sang to the rising moon. Inside, two people who'd found each other across vast distances of geography and experience held tight to new possibility. The world beyond their borders might shift and strain, but here, in this moment, in this place they'd claimed together, hope was taking root. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Spring melted into summer with unusual gentleness that year, as if the land itself recognized Ruth's delicate condition and offered its kindness. Her pregnancy progressed steadily, marked by the quiet transformations of her body and the careful adjustments to their daily routine. Tom had become almost comically protective, trying to take on all the heavy work himself, until Ruth firmly reminded him that pioneer women had been bearing children while working the land for generations. "I'm pregnant, not porcelain," she told him one morning when he tried to prevent her from carrying water buckets. "Maria worked until the day before she couldn't. I intend to do the same." The mention of Maria and what had happened sobered them both, but Ruth was nothing if not practical. She'd already begun correspondence with Mrs. Sandoval about midwifery, and had sent for medical texts from Denver. If trouble came, she intended to be as prepared as possible. The expanded garden thrived under her care, the three sisters' planting method producing abundant growth. The corn stood tall and strong, beans winding up the stalks, squash leaves spreading below in green profusion. It was, Tom thought, a living metaphor for the life they were building. Different elements supporting each other, creating something stronger together than apart. In July, unexpected visitors arrived. A small wagon approached the ranch, moving slowly in the afternoon heat. Tom recognized the driver, Father Miguel, making his rounds earlier than usual. But beside him sat an unfamiliar woman, elderly and straight-backed despite the rough road. Ruth emerged from the house, her condition now unmistakably visible beneath her loose work dress. She shaded her eyes, studying the approaching wagon with curiosity rather than concern. "Father Miguel," she called as they drew near.
"This is an unexpected pleasure."
The priest helped his companion down with careful courtesy. She was Apache, her face lined with years but her dark eyes sharp and knowing. She wore traditional dress modified for travel and carried herself with quiet authority. "Mrs. Walker," Father Miguel said formally. "May I present Mrs. Elena Birdsong, Tom's grandmother." Ruth felt Tom go still beside her. He'd mentioned his grandmother, the one James had spoken of, but had given no indication she might visit. The two women studied each other across a divide of culture and generation, each taking the other's measure. Finally, Elena Birdsong spoke, her English careful but clear. "So, you are the woman who stayed?" "I am,"
Ruth replied simply, "You're welcome in our home." The old woman's eyes moved to Ruth's obvious pregnancy, something shifting in her expression. "My grandson did not tell me there would be a child. We only recently felt certain enough to hope," Tom said, finding his voice. "Grandmother, I didn't expect—" "You don't write, you don't visit, but you expect me to stay away when there's family business." Her tone was sharp, but not unkind. "James told me about your trip to the fort, about speaking for the people. It was time I saw for myself what kind of life you've built here." They gathered in the main room, Ruth serving coffee and the sweet bread she'd baked that morning. The conversation moved carefully at first, feeling its way like water finding channels in dry ground. Father Miguel, it emerged, had encountered Elena on the road and offered to guide her, seeing an opportunity for reconciliation. "Your home is well kept," Elena observed, her keen eyes missing nothing. "Clean, but lived in. And the garden I saw. The 3 sisters, you planted them correctly." "Tom taught me," Ruth said, "from his memories of you." "Did he also teach you our ways with children, our medicines, our traditions?" Ruth felt the challenge beneath the question. "He's taught me some things. I hope to learn more, if you're willing to share that knowledge." Elena turned to Tom. "She's bold. This one, not like the others who ran crying." "Ruth doesn't run," Tom said quietly. "Not from anything." "We'll see." But there was approval in the old woman's voice. Elena stayed 3 days, and they were among the most educational of Ruth's life. The elderly Apache woman was a repository of practical knowledge about childbirth, child-rearing, and survival in hard country. She showed Ruth plants that grew wild on their land, ones for easing birth pains, for increasing milk, for treating infant ailments. "Your people have their medicine," Elena said as they gathered herbs in the cool morning. "It has its place, but this land has provided for mothers and babies since before memory. Why ignore such gifts?" She also told stories in the evening, myths and histories woven together until Ruth couldn't separate them. Stories about Tom's parents, about the choices that led to his mixed heritage, about the strengths and struggles of living between worlds. "The child you carry," Elena said on her last night, "will have 3 bloods. Apache, Mexican, Anglo, 3 ways of seeing. This can be a burden or a blessing." "How do we make it a blessing?" Ruth asked. "By teaching truth, all truths, not just the comfortable ones. By showing that strength comes from understanding, not from choosing sides." She looked at Tom. "Your parents knew this. They died too soon to finish teaching it. Perhaps you'll have better luck." The next morning, as Father Miguel prepared to take Elena back to her people, the old woman placed her weathered hands on Ruth's swollen belly. She spoke words in Apache that Tom later translated as a blessing for safe delivery and a strong spirit. "You'll come back?" Ruth asked. "When the baby arrives?" Elena smiled, the expression transforming her stern face. "Try to keep me away. This child will need all its grandmothers." She paused, then added, "You've done well, choosing this one. Grandson. She has the strength for this life." After they left, Ruth found herself crying. Hormones, she told herself, but Tom knew better. His grandmother's approval meant more than any town acceptance could have. August brought intense heat and increasing discomfort. Ruth modified her work, but didn't stop, harvesting the garden's abundance and preserving food for winter. Tom watched her with wonder. Even heavily pregnant, she maintained her methodical efficiency, planning for a future that now definitely included a child. The baby began moving vigorously, especially in the evenings when Ruth finally sat still. They would sit together, Tom's hand on her belly, feeling the rolls and kicks of new life asserting itself. Active, Ruth observed one night, like someone else I know who can't rest until all the work is done, or like someone who approaches every task with determination. Tom countered, "This child will be formidable with us as parents." "Or exhausted," Ruth said dryly, but she was smiling. September arrived with cooling winds and the first hints of autumn color in the aspens. Ruth's time was drawing near, and Tom had already sent word to Mrs. Sandoval, who had promised to come when needed. They'd prepared as much as possible. Clean linen stored, water barrels filled, the bedroom arranged for the birth. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains, Ruth asked, "Are you disappointed we can't have the doctor from town?" Tom understood. Doctor. Hartwell had made it clear he didn't attend mixed births, though he'd phrased it more delicately. They'd have Mrs. Sandoval and her daughter Rosa, both experienced midwives, but no formal medical help if something went wrong. "I trust the Sandoval women," Tom said carefully, "and your own strength. But if you're worried—" "I'm not worried," Ruth interrupted. "Well, no more than any woman facing her first birth at 31. I just wanted to know your thoughts." Tom pulled her close. "As much as her bulk would allow, my thoughts are that you've faced everything else this life has thrown at us with courage and wisdom. This won't be different. Even if—" She didn't finish. But he knew. Even if things went as they had with Maria, even if this joy turned to sorrow, even then, he said firmly, we'll face whatever comes together. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to go up to Maria's grave tomorrow. To, I don't know, pay respects, ask for her blessing, maybe." "She would give it freely," Tom said, throat tight. "She would have liked you, Ruth, liked your strength, your practical heart. She would be glad I found you." The next day, they climbed the hill slowly, Ruth needing frequent rests. At Maria's grave, marked with a simple wooden cross and surrounded by the wildflowers Tom planted each spring, Ruth stood quietly for a long time. "Finally," she spoke, addressing the wooden marker as if Maria could hear, "I'm caring for him, for the home you built together. I hope I'm doing it in a way that honors what you started." She placed a hand on her belly. "And if you have any influence wherever you are, we could use your help in the coming days." A breeze stirred the aspens, their leaves whispering secrets. Tom felt a strange peace settle over him. The past and present seemed to merge in that moment. Two women who'd never met but who shared an understanding of this land, this life, this man they'd both chosen. As they made their way back down the hill, Ruth paused suddenly, her hand going to her back. "Ruth." "Just a twinge," she said, but her face was thoughtful. "Though, perhaps we should send word to Mrs. Sandoval sooner rather than later." Tom's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll ride over this afternoon." Ruth smiled, that calm expression he'd come to rely on. "Good. I have a feeling our child has inherited impatience from somewhere, though I can't imagine which parent that might be." They returned to the house, Ruth moving with careful deliberation. As Tom prepared to fetch the Sandoval women, he paused to kiss his wife, tasting determination and just a hint of fear on her lips. "Bring them quickly," she said softly, "but safely. We have time yet, but not as much as I'd hoped." Tom rode hard but careful, his mind split between the woman laboring at home and the journey ahead. By the time he returned with Mrs. Sandoval and Rosa, the sun was setting and Ruth's pains had intensified. The women took charge immediately, sending Tom to boil water and prepare supplies while they examined Ruth. Their competent presence transformed the bedroom into a birthing chamber, everything arranged with practiced efficiency. "All is well," Mrs. Sandoval assured him when he brought the requested items. "The baby is positioned correctly, and your Ruth is strong. Now we wait and work." The night stretched long, punctuated by Ruth's controlled breathing and occasional sharp cries. Tom stayed close when allowed, offering water, holding her hand, being present in the way she'd taught him, as a true partner even in this most female of mysteries. Near dawn,
as the first light touched the windows. The baby's cries joined the sounds of the new day. Tom, exhausted and exhilarated, was allowed into the room to find Ruth propped against pillows, sweaty and triumphant, holding a wrapped bundle.
"A son,"
she said, her voice hoarse but proud. "Small but perfect. Come meet him." Tom approached slowly, as if in a dream. The baby was indeed small but vigorously alive, his tiny fists waving in protest at the bright world. His skin was the color of café con leche, his hair dark and already thick.
"He's beautiful,"
Tom whispered, touching one perfect hand. The baby gripped his finger with surprising strength.
"He needs a name,"
Ruth said practically, though tears tracked down her cheeks.
"We never settled on one."
Tom looked at his son, this child of 3 worlds, born on land that had seen so much struggle and hope. "Samuel," he said finally. "Samuel James Walker, for strength and for family."
"Samuel,"
Ruth repeated, testing the name.
"Yes, it suits him."
As the sun rose fully, bathing the room in golden light, the new family rested together. Outside, the ranch awakened to its daily rhythms, cattle lowing, chickens scratching, the eternal wind testing the fences. But inside, in the home built by one love and strengthened by another, Samuel James Walker began his first day in a world that would challenge him to bridge differences and find strength in complexity. Tom looked at his wife and son, feeling the weight and wonder of continuation. They'd built something here, not just a ranch or a marriage, but a future. It wouldn't be easy. Samuel would face the same challenges his parents had, magnified by an additional layer of complexity. But he would also have advantages they hadn't. Parents who understood both the struggles and the possibilities. A home rooted in honest work and mutual respect. A foundation built not on fairy tales, but on the solid ground of chosen commitment. "Thank you," he whispered to Ruth, who was already drowsing, exhausted but watchful even in rest.
"For what?"
she murmured.
"For staying, for building this with me, for him."
Ruth's smile was tired but real. "Where else would I go? This is home." And it was, not the home any of them had originally imagined, but the one they'd created through patience, determination, and the kind of love that grew from shared labor and mutual understanding. As Samuel settled into his first sleep, safe between his parents, the sun climbed higher over the New Mexico mountains, blessing a ranch where 3 worlds met in one small, perfect child. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer empty. The Walker Ranch had new life, new purpose, new hope. And in the grand tapestry of the frontier, where cultures clashed and blended, where the old ways met the new in sometimes painful collision, one family had found a way to weave something beautiful from all the threads available to them. It was, Tom thought as he drifted toward sleep, more than enough. It was abundance itself. Thank you for listening to this story of love, resilience, and partnership in the American frontier. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss this tale of Tom and Ruth Walker. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to click the hype button to help more people discover these authentic tales of the Old West. Your support means everything,